Imagine, uh, imagine you are sitting at a small gray desk.
Okay.
You're in this brightly lit room, and there's a man standing next to you wearing this crisp, authoritative white lab coat.
Right, a classic scientific setup.
Exactly. And he points to a panel of switches. He tells you to press a button, and you know for an absolute fact that pressing this button will send a severe, agonizing electric shock into another human being.
A person sitting right in the room next door.
Yes. You can actually hear them shifting in their chair through the wall. You're sweating. Your hands are shaking.
Yeah.
Your brain is practically screaming at you to stand up, to yell at the man in the coat, and just run out the door.
But you don't.
No. Your hand slowly reaches out, trembling, and your finger presses the button anyway. Why? Why on earth would you do that?
It is, it's really the single most terrifying question in the history of psychology.
It's deeply unsettling.
Because the answer forces us to look in a mirror. And we have to realize that the reflection staring back at us might not be entirely real. We like to think we have this solid, unwavering core of morality, right?
Yeah, that we're basically good people.
Exactly. But in reality, when the right kind of pressure is applied, that core just dissolves.
Which brings us to the core of today's deep dive. And it's a question that you, listening to this right now, probably do not want to ask yourself on a random morning. How much of your daily life is actually you?
That is the uncomfortable question.
Right. And how much of it is just a character you are playing because society demands it?
When we look at the diagnostic landscape of human identity, we don't find a clean X-ray with a solid bone structure. We find layers upon layers of performances.
It just masks all the way down.
We find adaptations. And what we are going to do in this deep dive is systematically strip away those layers. We are going to look at the profound tension between the authentic self, the messy, raw core of who you actually are, and the masks that you are forced to wear just to survive.
And the stack of research we have on the table today is massive. It is dense, it is dark, and it doesn't pull any punches at all.
It really doesn't.
We've got Carl Jung's foundational writings on the persona to help us understand the architecture of these masks. We've got modern research looking at how we build digital identities.
We're also diving into a huge cross-cultural workplace study by Hamilton and Sanders looking at why we commit crimes of obedience.
Yes. And we have, of course, Stanley Milgram's horrifying shock experiments from Yale. Plus, Thibault Latexier's explosive new debunking of the infamous Stanford prison experiment.
And finally, to anchor all of this to our actual physical bodies, we have medical research on the very real physiological epidemic of loneliness.
The overarching mission here is to unmask the human psyche. We're going to examine the raw materials we use to construct our social faces.
And we'll look at the mechanisms authority uses to weaponize those faces against our own internal moral compass.
And then we'll end by looking at the literal brain chemistry that makes us so terrified of isolation. We will sacrifice our true selves just to stay in the pack.
It's a heavy journey.
It is. So I want to start right at the foundation. Before we can talk about why people do terrible things in laboratories or office buildings, we have to understand the daily psychological armor we all put on every morning. Let's talk about Carl Jung.
Let's do it. In the early 20th century, the Swiss psychiatrist Carl Jung gave us a framework that has completely permeated how we understand human interaction.
He called it the persona.
Yes, it comes from the Latin word for the theatrical masks worn by actors in ancient Greek and Roman plays.
So it literally just translates to the mask.
Precisely. Jung defined the persona as the social face that an individual presents to the world. But it's not a simple disguise.
It's more complicated than that.
Much more. It's a highly complex compromise. It is designed, on one hand, to make a very definite, calculated impression upon other people. And on the other hand, it is designed to completely conceal the true, often chaotic nature of the individual wearing it.
I was trying to think of a way to visualize this earlier, and the best thing I could come up with is the difference between someone's LinkedIn profile and their actual physical brain.
Ah, that's a great analogy.
Right, because your LinkedIn profile is this highly curated, sanitized list of achievements. You are a synergistic self-starter who thrives in fast-paced environments.
Nobody actually thinks like that.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Your actual brain is just chaos. It's anxieties about your mortgage, weird dreams you had last night, half-remembered song lyrics from 2004, and this lingering fear of failure.
That is a perfect modern illustration. The LinkedIn profile is pure persona. And what is vital to understand is that Jung did not view the persona as inherently bad or evil.
Oh, you didn't?
No, he actually argued that developing a viable, functional social persona is a mandatory part of adapting to adult life. You cannot function in a complex society without one.
Right, because if I go to the bank to ask for a loan, I don't want the bank teller expressing their raw, unfiltered, chaotic inner self while they look at my financials.
You'd run out of the building?
Yeah, I want them to wear the mask of a professional, emotionally stable bank teller. I need them to play the role so I can play the role of the responsible customer.
Exactly. The persona acts as a psychological shock absorber. It lubricates social interactions so we don't have to constantly navigate the exhausting depths of everyone's true, complex humanity in every single transaction.
That makes sense. It's a survival tool.
It is, but, and this is the massive caveat in Jung's work, there is a tremendous danger involved. And that danger is over-identification.
Meaning you forget you're wearing it.
Meaning the ego completely fuses with the artificial construct.
Yeah.
Jung wrote extensively about the peril of becoming identical with your persona.
What does that look like in practice?
Well, the classic example is the university professor who literally becomes his textbook,
Okay.
or the opera tenor who becomes nothing more than his voice.
Or, in our modern context, the influencer who becomes indistinguishable from their engagement metrics.
Exactly. When this happens, the individual loses their distinct human being.
I've definitely met people like that,
Hmm.
where you try to have a conversation with them at a dinner party, and they can only speak in corporate buzzwords.
Right. They can't turn it off.
It's like nobody is home. There's no soul behind the eyes, just a middle management algorithm.
Jung described the result of this fusion as a shallow, brittle, conformist kind of personality. He said they become all persona, driven by an excessive, almost pathological concern for what people think.
That sounds exhausting.
It is. They lose all consciousness of the distinction between themselves and the social expectations placed upon them.
Okay, but Jung was writing this decades before the internet existed,
Mm.
before we all walked around with supercomputers in our pockets.
True.
And looking at the research we have from the International Journal of Novel Trends and Innovation, it seems like digital culture hasn't just adopted the persona, it has strapped a rocket engine to it.
It has fundamentally altered the architecture of the mask. In the physical world, historically, you could take the mask off.
You go to work, you play the employee.
You come home, you close the door, you take off the mask, and you are just yourself in your living room. But the research points out that in the digital age, identity is no longer a private, cyclical experience. It is a dynamic, continuous, 24/7 performance.
Right. I was reading about this sociologist from the 50s, Irving Goffman, who talked about life being a theatrical stage where we are managing impressions.
Yes, the dramaturgical model.
Social media takes that stage and just removes the curtains entirely. The lights are always on.
And you are the director, the star, and the marketing department all at once. You are constantly curating a version of yourself that highlights only the positive, attractive, or enviable aspects of your life.
You're filtering out reality.
You are actively, continuously pruning away your complexity, your conflicts, your vulnerabilities. It creates a digital mask that is incredibly rigid and totally unrealistic.
But wait, if I'm spending all my psychological energy projecting this flawless aesthetic lifestyle on Instagram or X, where does all my actual messiness go?
It doesn't just disappear.
Right, like my anger, my pettiness, my sadness, it doesn't just evaporate because I didn't post about it.
No, it doesn't. And this is where Jung's framework becomes incredibly dark. The human psyche demands balance.
Okay.
When you pour all your conscious energy into maintaining a rigid, flawless persona, all those repressed, hidden, socially unacceptable traits are shoved down into the unconscious. Jung called this accumulation of repressed traits the shadow.
The shadow. That sounds ominous.
It represents everything the conscious self refuses to acknowledge. It is your pettiness, your jealousy, your rage.
And I'm guessing the internet plays a role here too.
A massive one. What the digital culture research shows us is that the architecture of the internet provides the perfect, consequence-free playground for the shadow to run wild.
Let me guess anonymity.
Yes. The researcher John Suhler famously termed it the online disinhibition effect. Because our primary digital masks are so rigid and so tied to our real-world reputations, we actively seek out anonymous spaces.
Like Reddit forums or burner accounts on X.
Exactly. Unmoderated comment sections. We use them to let the shadow off the leash.
That makes so much sense. That explains the bizarre phenomena of internet trolling. It's not that these people are necessarily sociopaths in real life.
Right. They could be very normal.
They might be perfectly polite accountants or teachers who are wearing an incredibly tight persona all day, And then they go home, log onto a burner account, and just spew venom at a stranger over a movie review.
It is the psychological pressure valve releasing. The research on digital platforms, particularly studies looking at moral outrage, shows that we use the shield of digital anonymity to express cruelty.
Cruelty that our real-world masks would never allow.
Exactly. The individual becomes profoundly fragmented. You have the glossy, brittle digital persona demanding validation on one app, and the dark, unacknowledged shadow creeping around, causing chaos in the comment section of another.
But surely a person can't live split in half like that forever. It sounds like a psychological time bomb.
It is. Jung posited that this extreme imbalance is entirely unsustainable. Eventually, the structural integrity of the mask fails.
What happens then?
The excessive commitment to collective ideals while repressing your deeper individuality leads to a collapse. Jung called this breaking point an antiodromia.
Enantiodromia. Wow. Okay. It sounds like a terminal medical diagnosis.
In psychological terms, it practically is. It refers to the dramatic emergence of the repressed individuality from beneath the fractured persona.
So the mask just shatters.
Think of it like building a massive gleaming skyscraper on a completely cracked, unstable foundation. You can keep adding shiny glass panels to the outside, polishing your digital mask, getting promotions, buying the right clothes. But eventually, the sheer weight of the artificiality causes the foundation to give way.
And the whole building pancakes.
Exactly.
And what does that look like for the person experiencing it? Do they just wake up one day and have a midlife crisis?
It is often vastly more painful than a cliché midlife crisis. Jung describes the dissolution of the persona as an agonizing process of disintegration. It brings massive disorientation and chaos.
Because they don't know who they are anymore.
Right. Because think about it. If you have believed your entire adult life that you are the prestigious professor or you are the flawless lifestyle influencer, and suddenly that identity is stripped away or shatters, who are you?
You're nobody. You're just a stranger in your own body.
You are left staring into the void. Jung wrote that it develops into a stark encounter with reality, with no false veils or adornments of any kind.
The external validation is completely gone.
The fantasy of the perfect social role is gone. The person is left to sift through the ruins of their own artificiality. It is a state of deeply disturbed psychic equilibrium.
Okay, so this sounds terrifying, but it raises a huge practical question for me.
Go ahead.
If the mask is this dangerous, if it's going to eventually collapse and ruin my life, should I just stop wearing one? Is the goal of all this deep psychological analysis to just walk around with zero mask?
To just be completely unfiltered.
Yeah, just be my raw, unfiltered, chaotic self 24/7. Say exactly what I'm thinking to my boss, cry openly in the grocery store if I feel sad, just let the shadow and the core self hang out in public.
It's a logical question, but no. And Jung was incredibly clear about this. He argued that a person who attempts to live with absolutely no persona is blind to the reality of the world.
Because they'd probably get fired in a week and lose all their friends.
Precisely. Society requires a minimum baseline of predictable behavior. Jung called the maskless individual a hopeless dreamer.
Hopeless in what way?
Society views them as incredibly tactless, eternally misunderstood, someone who treats the external world as a personal playground, rather than a shared cooperative reality. If you have no mask, you cannot engage in the social contracts required for survival.
So we are trapped. We need the mask to survive, but the mask will eventually suffocate us. What is the way out?
The goal, the psychological solution Jung proposed, is a process called individuation.
Individuation.
Okay. The objective is not the destruction of the persona, but its restoration and realignment. It is about building a realistic, flexible persona.
Flexible is the key word there.
Exactly. One that allows you to navigate the complexities of human society, to perform your necessary roles, the employee, the parent, the friend, but, crucially, a mask that does not collide with or obscure your true self.
So it's like wearing a jacket instead of a straitjacket. You know you're wearing it. You know it serves a purpose. It keeps you warm in the social climate, but you can take it off and hang it up when you get home.
That is exactly it. You recognize the mask as a functional tool, not your entire identity.
Okay, that makes sense on an individual level. The persona is our armor. It's how we navigate the world without getting constantly emotionally bruised.
Right.
But I want to pivot here because the research we have on the table takes this concept into a much darker arena. If the persona is our armor, what happens when the people who issue that armor, our bosses, our institutions, society at large, demand that the armor do something fundamentally immoral?
This is where we transition from the internal theoretical construction of the mask to its external behavioral exploitation. We leave the realm of psychoanalysis and enter the realm of sociology and organizational behavior.
Because the workplace is really the most rigid stage we perform on.
It is perhaps the most demanding stage for our social roles.
Which brings us to this massive cross-cultural study by Hamilton and Sanders, published in the Journal of Social Issues. They were looking at crimes of obedience and conformity in the workplace.
A fascinating study.
And what struck me immediately about this research is that it completely dismantles how we normally think about corporate evil. When we watch a movie about a toxic spill or a pharmaceutical cover-up, there's always a mustache-twirling villain in a boardroom rubbing his hands together.
The stereotypical evil CEO.
Exactly. But this study says the reality of evil is vastly more boring. It's bureaucratic.
It is incredibly banal. Organizational wrongdoing rarely relies on a single psychopath. It relies on hundreds of ordinary, decent people who have simply adopted the persona of the good employee and agreed to go along with the system.
They just surrender themselves to the role.
Hamilton and Sanders wanted to understand the psychological mechanisms that allow good people to participate in bad systems, and they explicitly differentiate between two forces, obedience and conformity.
I always kind of thought those were the same thing, just doing what you're told so you don't stand out.
In everyday language, we blend them.
Yeah.
But sociologically, drawing on Stanley Milgram's framework, they are distinct mechanisms for surrendering the self. Hamilton and Sanders outline 4 key differences.
Let's break those down. What's the first one?
The first is hierarchy. Obedience occurs within a vertical structure. It requires a hierarchy. A subordinate follows the direct orders of a superior who has the recognized institutional right to prescribe behavior.
Like a general to a private or a manager to a cashier.
Exactly. Conformity, on the other hand, operates horizontally. It regulates behavior among equals peer-to-peer. It's about matching the group norm.
Okay, what's the second difference?
Imitation. Conformity relies entirely on imitation. It leads to the homogenization of behavior. If you notice that all your peers are quietly falsifying their safety reports to save time, you start falsifying yours to blend in.
You imitate them.
Right. Obedience does not require imitation. The manager who orders you to falsify the report isn't necessarily falsifying reports themselves. They are sitting in an office issuing directives.
Right. The boss tells you to clean the hazardous chemical spill without gloves, but the boss isn't grabbing a mop.
Precisely. The third difference is explicitness. In obedience, the demand is clear and explicit. Do this by Friday. Change these numbers.
It's stated out loud.
Yes. In conformity, the pressure is entirely implicit. Your coworkers don't hold a meeting and order you to falsify the safety report. You just feel the silent, heavy weight of the group culture demanding that you don't slow them down by being a stickler for the rules.
Like the unwritten rule. Everyone just knows how we do things around here. But it's this fourth difference that I found so philosophically profound.
The question of voluntarism.
Yes, because it deals with how we justify our own actions to ourselves after the fact.
This is about agency and excuse. When individuals conform to a group norm, say, joining in on bullying a coworker, they often deny, even to themselves, that they were influenced by the group.
Oh, interesting.
Because the pressure was implicit, they embraced their actions as voluntary, they convinced themselves they wanted to do it.
Like, I don't like that guy anyway, he deserves it.
Yeah.
They take ownership of the mask.
Exactly. But with obedience, the psychological maneuver is the exact opposite. When individuals commit a terrible act because of a direct order, they actively, desperately deny their own voluntarism. They completely reject their own agency.
They point up the ladder.
They point to the hierarchy and use obedience as their absolute excuse.
The classic defense, I was just following orders. We've heard it in every major historical tribunal of the 20th century. It is the ultimate abdication of the true self.
You are disowning your own actions.
You are literally saying to the world, I didn't do this. My authentic self wasn't even in the room. The mask of the employee did this. The uniform did this. You have to blame the guy who issued the uniform.
It is a profound psychological shield, and Hamilton and Sanders wanted to test how the general public perceives this shield. Does society actually accept the "I was just following orders" defense?
And how did they test that?
To find out, they presented a series of complex vignettes, hypothetical scenarios of severe workplace wrongdoing to survey respondents.
And this wasn't just a survey of college kids in California. This was cross-cultural. They surveyed citizens in Washington, D.C., Moscow, and Tokyo.
So you have a broad spectrum of cultural norms.
Right, you have the ultimate individualistic culture in the U.S. compared to the more collectivistic and hierarchically structured cultures of Russia and Japan.
And the vignettes they designed were not minor infractions like stealing office supplies. They were severe moral breaches. One scenario involved a foreman at a chemical plant.
Right, I remember this one.
He is under immense pressure from upper management to cut disposal costs. So he makes the decision to dump highly toxic waste directly into a nearby river, which causes severe illness in the downstream community.
Another one involved an automotive design engineer who realizes the new car model has a fatal flaw in the braking system, but rushes it to market anyway to meet corporate deadlines, resulting in deaths.
Terrible scenarios.
A third was a pharmaceutical scientist who discovers a new drug causes blindness in a small percentage of users, but hides the data so the drug gets approved. These are heavy life-and-death moral failures.
To test the mechanisms of excuse, the researchers varied the context of the stories for different respondents. In some versions, the actor, the foreman, the engineer, the scientist acted completely autonomously out of their own ambition.
And in others,
In other versions, they were explicitly conforming to the behavior of their peers. And in the final versions, they were obeying direct, explicit orders from their superiors.
so they manipulated the social pressure.
Yes. Then they asked the respondents across all three cultures, how morally and legally responsible is this person for the harm caused?
Okay, let's look at the baseline results first, because I found this fascinating. Did people buy the excuse?
At the micro level, the results were incredibly consistent across the board. The actors who acted autonomously were judged to be the most responsible. They received the harshest judgment.
Makes sense. They chose to be evil.
Well, exactly. The obedient actors, the ones who could say, my boss told me to do it, were judged to be the least responsible. The conformers fell somewhere in the middle.
So on a basic human level, the public instinctively accepts that giving up your autonomy to an authority figure mitigates your moral culpability. We inherently understand the weight of the mask.
We do. We recognize that going against a direct order from an authority threatens an individual's livelihood, and we factor that survival instinct into our moral judgment of them. But as you mentioned, the macro-level comparison, the cultural difference, is where the sociology gets truly fascinating.
Right. Comparing the U.S. to Russia and Japan, what did they find?
They found that in the hierarchical collectivist cultures of Moscow and Tokyo, the social influence situation, the fact that the actor was commanded to do the bad thing, acted as a massive, heavy excuse for the subordinate's responsibility.
Much more so than in Washington, D.C.
Correct. The collectivist cultures inherently recognize the overwhelming, almost inescapable weight of the societal role. In a culture where the group and the hierarchy are paramount, the individual's true self is expected to defer.
So in Japan or Russia, I was just following orders. Defense actually works better in the court of public opinion. They are more likely to forgive the guy dumping the toxic waste if the CEO told him to.
Yes, generally speaking. However, there was one specific, fascinating caveat in the data that transcended all cultural boundaries, and it had to do with where the wrongdoer sat in the corporate hierarchy.
Let me guess. It matters if you're the guy turning the valve versus the guy managing the plant.
Exactly. The study varied the status of the wrongdoer. Sometimes the person dumping the waste was a low-level factory foreman. Sometimes it was a mid-level authority, like the plant manager.
And how did the respondents judge them differently?
The results showed that while low-level subordinates were readily granted the excuse of following orders, authorities, the mid-level managers, were held highly responsible regardless of the culture and regardless of whether they themselves were pressured from above.
Wait, I don't get that. The plant manager has a boss too, right? He answers to the vice president or the CEO of the conglomerate. So if the CEO orders the plant manager to cut costs and the manager orders the foreman to dump the waste, why doesn't the manager get the same psychological shield as the foreman? He was following orders too.
It comes down to the sociological concept of agency. Society fundamentally expects individuals in positions of authority to possess and exercise moral agency.
Because they have more power.
As the researchers noted, an authority figure is perceived as less of a pawn being pushed around on the corporate stage. They are paid more, they have more resources, and therefore society expects them to have a stronger, more autonomous spine.
So the higher you climb the corporate ladder, the thinner the mask obedience gets. Society doesn't allow you to hide behind it anymore.
Correct. Subordination itself carries a psychological and often legal implication of a loss of volition. When you are at the absolute bottom of the totem pole, society basically agrees that your true self has been forcefully overwritten by your role.
But if you're management,
If you have an office with a door and a managerial title, society expects your true self to be present and accountable.
okay, so what does this mean for us? It means that in our daily lives, we are incredibly comfortable outsourcing our moral compass to our boss. We accept that the persona of the good employee might require us to do things that our authentic self would find repulsive.
Exactly.
We might not be dumping toxic waste, but maybe we are lying to a client, or unfairly firing a subordinate, or ignoring a safety hazard.
And we justify it by saying, it's my job, it's above my pay grade.
Right. But here's the limitation of the Hamilton and Sanders study. It's a survey. It's people sitting in a coffee shop in Tokyo or a living room in D.C., circling boxes on a piece of paper about hypothetical scenarios.
It's very easy to answer a survey.
Exactly. It's easy to say what you think about obedience on paper. The real terrifying question is what happens when you aren't reading a vignette? What happens when you are the one being ordered to cause harm in real time? Would you actually do it?
To answer that, we have to leave the theoretical world of surveys and step into the laboratory. We have to look at the most infamous, controversial, and revealing psychological experiment of the 20th century.
We must discuss Stanley Milgram.
We must.
Milgram, 1963.
Yeah.
Yale University. This is the crucible. This is where the rubber meets the road on the human soul. Because Milgram wasn't asking people what they thought about obedience.
He was testing it directly.
He was ordering them to inflict agonizing pain on another human being right there in the room to see if they would actually do it.
The methodology of this experiment is crucial to understand because it was a masterclass in psychological manipulation. Milgram designed a situation that systematically eroded the subject's authentic self and reinforced their obedient persona.
Let's paint the picture for the listener. Put yourself in this scenario. You live in New Haven, Connecticut in 1963. You answer an ad in the local newspaper offering $4.50 to participate in a study on memory and learning at Yale University.
So you're expecting a standard academic test.
Right. You show up to this imposing Ivy League campus, you enter the elegant interaction laboratory, and you meet two men.
The first man is the experimenter. He is a stern, impassive 31-year-old high school biology teacher, specifically chosen for his authoritative demeanor. Crucially, he is wearing a gray technician's coat.
The uniform of objective science.
The uniform of objective science.
The second man you meet is the other volunteer, a 47-year-old, mild-mannered accountant. He seems a little nervous, very polite. The experimenter explains that the study is looking at the effect of punishment on learning.
So far, it sounds plausible.
One of you will be the teacher, and the other will be the learner. You draw slips of paper from a hat to decide the roles. You unfold your paper. It says teacher. The accountant gets learner.
But of course, the draw is entirely rigged. Both slips of paper say teacher.
So the naive subject is always the teacher.
Always. The mild-mannered accountant is not a volunteer. He's a trained actor, a Confederate working for Milgram.
You watch as the experimenter takes the accountant into an adjacent small room. He seats him in a chair and straps his arms down. He attaches an electrode to the accountant's wrist.
They make a whole show of the physical restraints.
They really do. The experimenter applies a paste, explicitly stating it is to avoid blisters and burns. The accountant mentions, seemingly offhand, that he has a mild heart condition.
A very deliberate detail.
And the experimenter reassures him, although the shocks can be extremely painful, they cause no permanent tissue damage.
The subject, Yuki, is then escorted back into the main room and seated in front of the instrument of punishment, the shock generator.
And this thing looks terrifyingly real. It's a massive metal console with 30 switches arranged in a horizontal line. The switches range from 15 volts on the far left, moving up in 15-volt increments, all the way to 450 volts on the far right.
And beneath the switches are engraved labels.
Right. It starts with slight shock, moves up to moderate shock, then strong shock, very strong shock, intense shock, extreme intensity shock, danger severe shock.
And finally, the last two switches are simply marked with an ominous XXXX.
The protocol you are given is straightforward. You must read a series of word pairs to the learner through a microphone. Then you test his memory. Every time he gets an answer wrong, you must press a switch and administer an electric shock.
And the critical rule, with every single wrong answer, you must move one level higher on the shock generator, 15 volts, then 30, then 45, and so on.
You cannot see the learner. You can only hear him through the wall. And at first it seems fine. He gets a few right, he gets a few wrong. You press the 15-volt switch, the 30-volt switch, you hear a slight grunt from the next room. No big deal.
Just a little discomfort.
But as you move up the board, the actor's responses escalate.
The actor's script was meticulously timed to the voltage levels. At 75 volts, he begins to grunt in pain. At 120 volts, he shouts that the shocks are becoming too painful.
And then it gets worse.
At 150 volts, he demands to be released from the experiment, citing his heart condition.
At 270 volts, his protests become agonizing screams. At 300 volts, he shouts in absolute desperation that he will no longer provide answers to the memory test.
The tension in the room at that point is unimaginable.
And eventually, as you approach the 400-volt range, silence. A deafening, terrifying silence. He isn't answering, he isn't screaming, he's just gone.
And throughout this entire escalating nightmare, the subject inevitably hesitates. They turn to the experimenter in the gray coat, sitting just a few feet away taking notes.
They must have been begging to stop.
They say, "I think he's hurt. I don't want to do this anymore. We need to check on him."
And what does the experimenter say? Does he threaten them? Does he pull out a gun?
No, the experimenter is trained to use 4 very specific, measured verbal prods. Prod 1, please continue. If the subject resists, prod 2, the experiment requires that you continue.
Just calm, bureaucratic pressure.
If they still resist, prod 3, it is absolutely essential that you continue. And the final, ultimate assertion of authority, prod 4. You have no other choice. You must go on.
Before Milgram ran this experiment, he surveyed 14 Yale psychology seniors and a group of psychiatrists. He described the setup and asked them to predict the outcome. What did the experts think would happen?
They predicted that nearly everyone would defy the experimenter early on. They hypothesized that only an insignificant minority, perhaps 1 to 3% of subjects, representing the statistically pathological sadists in the population, would proceed all the way to 450 volts.
1 to 3%.
They believed that the authentic human self, with its deep-seated evolutionary and moral aversion to inflicting pain on an innocent person, would easily, effortlessly override the polite requests of a man in a lab coat.
They fundamentally believed in the triumph of the true self over the situational role.
They did, but they were wrong, horrifyingly, tragically wrong.
Out of the 40 ordinary men who walked into that laboratory, businessmen, teachers, postal workers, 26 of them went all the way to the end of the board.
A staggering number.
65%. 2/3 of the subjects continued to administer shocks up to 450 volts to a man who had screamed about his heart condition and then fallen completely silent.
And we must emphasize a critical detail here, one that often gets lost in the shorthand retellings of this study. These subjects were not enjoying themselves.
They weren't just happily shocking him.
No, they were not revealing a hidden, sadistic shadow self. The internal conflict they experienced was devastating.
The paper describes it in vivid detail. They weren't just casually pressing buttons. They were experiencing extreme levels of physical and nervous tension. The researchers observed subjects sweating profusely, trembling, stuttering, constantly biting their lips, groaning out loud.
It was a physiological manifestation of their moral panic.
They were literally digging their fingernails into their own flesh.
14 of the 40 subjects developed severe nervous laughter, bizarre, completely incongruous fits of giggling that they couldn't control. And in 3 subjects, this immense psychological tension escalated into full-blown, uncontrollable physical seizures.
Seizures. Because of a psychological conflict.
Yes. One 46-year-old encyclopedia salesman had a convulsion so violently severe that they had to halt the experiment entirely because he was physically incapable of continuing.
Okay, stop. I have to push back here.
Yeah.
I have to ask the question that everyone screams at the TV when they watch documentaries about this.
I know exactly what you're going to ask.
Why did they just stand up and walk out? They weren't chained to the chair. The experimenter was a high school teacher with a clipboard, not a soldier with a rifle. They weren't going to be sent to prisons for leaving.
Right.
They'd already been paid the $4.50. Why on earth would you sit there digging your fingernails into your own skin until you have a seizure instead of just walking out the door?
It is the most vital question, and it speaks to the immense invisible power of the persona when it is locked into a hierarchy. Milgram identified several what he called binding factors.
Binding factors. What are the...
These are psychological chains that lock the individual into the situation, effectively suffocating the true self and forcing the persona of the good subject to take the wheel.
So are these chains?
The first is the aura of institutional authority. You aren't just in a room, you are at Yale University. The institution lends an unimpeachable veneer of legitimacy and scientific necessity to the entire proceeding.
Your brain assumes Yale wouldn't let a murder happen here, so this must be okay.
Right, the halo effect of the ivy on the walls. Second is the perceived contract. The subject believes the victim voluntarily submitted to the experiment, just as they did. They agreed to be there.
That shifts the blame a little.
Third is the illusion of fairness. The coin flip, which the subject believes was real, creates a narrative that the learner simply got unlucky. The subject feels it could have been me in that chair. He has to take his medicine because I would have had to take mine.
But the screaming, at some point, the contract has to be voided by the screaming. Right.
This brings us to the fourth and perhaps most effective binding factor, the pacing. Milgram specifically designed the experiment to be fast.
So there's no time to think.
The subject is forced to rapidly read word pairs, listen for the buzzer, announce the voltage, and flip the switch. There's absolutely no time for reflection. The moral conflict does not slowly approach from a distance. It crashes into the subject instantly.
You're overwhelmed.
You are cognitively overloaded. You are trapped between two deeply ingrained, fundamentally opposing behavioral dispositions. On one side, you have the evolutionary, empathetic urge not to harm a member of your own species. Your authentic self is screaming stop.
And on the other side?
On the other side, you have the heavily socialized, lifelong conditioning to obey a legitimate authority figure. From kindergarten to the corporate office, society trains you to follow the rules and please the person in charge.
And the tension, the sweating, the stuttering, the seizures, that is the physical manifestation of those two dispositions, literally tearing the psyche apart.
Right.
The true self and the persona are engaged in a death match inside the subject's brain.
Exactly. And in 65% of the cases, the persona won. The socialized habit of obedience overpowered the authentic self's morality.
That is deeply unsettling.
The individual's action became linked to a systemic purpose, completely bypassing their personal moral compass. As Milgram concluded, obedience is the dispositional cement that binds men to systems of authority.
It is an incredibly dark, heavy realization. We are, at our core, built to obey. We will prioritize the polite demands of the hierarchy over the literal cries for help from our peers.
It is dark. But historically, psychology didn't stop there. If Milgram proved that we will commit horrific acts when explicitly ordered to do so under immense psychological pressure, there's another experiment that is famous for supposedly proving something even worse.
Right. The idea that you don't even need the man in the gray coat giving orders. The idea that you don't need pressure.
The spontaneous generation of evil.
The theory that merely putting on a uniform, stepping into a role, and wearing a specific mask will naturally, spontaneously, turn a good person into a sadistic monster. I am talking, of course, about the 1971 Stanford prison experiment.
This brings us to a crucial juncture in our deep dive and a profound lesson in how we consume the narratives of science. The Stanford Prison Experiment, or SPE, is arguably the most famous psychological story of the 20th century.
Everyone has heard of it.
It is taught in every intro to psych class. It has inspired movies, documentaries, and endless philosophical debates about human nature.
But what if the story we've been told for the last 50 years is highly manipulated? What if the definitive textbook proof of humanity's latent evil was, in fact, nothing more than a theatrical production?
Let us first establish the myth, the standard narrative that was sold to the public.
Okay, the myth. 1971. Dr. Philip Zimbardo, a charismatic psychology professor, decides to build a mock prison in the basement of the Stanford Psychology Building. He recruits 24 normal, healthy, psychologically stable college students. He flips a coin. Half become guards, half become prisoners.
The physical immersion is key. The prisoners are stripped, sprayed with delousing powder, and given humiliating dress-like smocks with ID numbers sewn on them.
They stripped away their names.
They wear heavy chains on their right ankles and tight nylon stocking caps to simulate shaved heads.
And the guards are given the ultimate masks of authority. Khaki uniforms, wooden batons, whistles, and reflective aviator sunglasses so the prisoners can never see their eyes. Total anonymity.
According to the narrative pushed by Zimbardo for decades, the situation spontaneously generated tyranny. With no specific training, simply by putting on the uniforms and stepping into the environment, the guards organically became sadistic.
It just happened on its own.
Within days, they were psychologically torturing the prisoners. They stripped them naked, put bags over their heads, denied them sleep, forced them to clean toilet bowls with their bare hands, and locked them in a tiny dark closet for solitary confinement.
The psychological abuse was supposedly so severe, with perfectly healthy college kids suffering sudden dramatic nervous breakdowns, that Zimbardo was forced to abruptly shut down the planned 2-week experiment after just 6 days.
And the conclusion Zimbardo delivered to the world was devastating. He claimed the situation has the power to entirely corrupt human behavior. The mask of the guard inherently possessed the soul of the wearer.
It implies that we are all just a uniform away from becoming monsters.
The implication was that any of us, given the right uniform and the right environment, would become torturers. Our authentic morality is an illusion that crumbles the moment we are handed a baton.
It is a terrifying story. But then we look at the debunking. We look at the recent work by French researcher Thibault Letexier in his book, Investigating the Stanford Prison Experiment History of a Lie.
And the subsequent archival reviews by institutions like the University of Melbourne.
And suddenly, the X-ray shows a completely different, highly engineered skeleton.
This raises a vital question about how easily we're seduced by a compelling, pessimistic narrative. Letexier went into the Stanford archives. He unearthed unseen video footage, unreleased audio tapes, transcripts, and extensive interviews with the participants.
And what did the tapes show?
What he found completely dismantles the myth of spontaneous evil. The brutality of the guards did not organically bubble up from the dark depths of human nature. It was rehearsed. It was coached.
Zimbardo and his research team weren't just passively watching from behind a two-way mirror. They explicitly instructed the guards on how to create a psychologically hostile environment.
They actively shaped the abuse.
In Zimbardo's own later writings, he literally quotes his orientation speech to the guards. He says, we can create a sense of frustration, we can create fear in them, we're going to take away their individuality in various ways. In general, what all this should create in them is a sense of powerlessness.
That is not a neutral scientist making an observation. That is a director giving stage notes to his actors.
Exactly, and it goes deeper than just an orientation speech. The archival research highlights the role of Warden Jaffa, who was one of Zimbardo's undergraduate associates acting as the prison warden. He was constantly walking the floor, encouraging the guards' aggression.
The records showed that when a guard acted too leniently or didn't want to participate in the harassment, Jaffa would pull them aside and reprimand them.
He disciplined the guards for being too nice.
He explicitly told one reluctant guard, and this is documented, the guards have to know that every guard has to be what we call a tough guard. The success of this experiment rides on the behavior of the guards to make it seem as realistic as possible.
Are you kidding me? They were explicitly demanding that the participants perform the persona of a sadistic guard for the sake of the experiment. They were essentially saying, be mean, or you're ruining our science project.
It was entirely manufactured pressure.
And what about the prisoners? The myth says they were so broken by the environment that they had spontaneous psychotic breaks.
The reality of the prisoner's experience is equally problematic. The ethical protocols of any human experiment mandate that participants can leave at any time, but Letexier's research shows that the prisoners were led to believe they could not simply say, I quit, and walk out.
They felt trapped.
To get released, they felt they had to prove a medical or psychiatric emergency.
So if you're a 19-year-old kid trapped in a basement, people are yelling at you, you want to go home, but the professor won't let you just quit, what do?
You provide the only key that unlocks the door. You fake a breakdown. At least one prominent prisoner, who had a famously dramatic breakdown on camera that was used for decades to prove the horror of the prison, explicitly admitted later that he faked the entire emotional collapse just so he could escape the basement and go study for his upcoming exams.
It was acting. The guards were acting because the researchers told them to be tough, and the prisoners were acting because it was the only way to get out of a miserable weekend gig.
This brings us to a fundamental concept in experimental psychology known as demand characteristics.
What does that mean?
Demand characteristics occur when participants in an experiment subconsciously or consciously alter their behavior to fit what they believe the experimenter wants to see.
They try to be good subjects.
They try to be good subjects by providing the data they think the authority figure is looking for.
Oh, wow. So instead of revealing human nature, they're just revealing their ability to follow a script.
Exactly. And to prove how obvious the script was in the SPE, a separate study by Banirazizi and Movahedi presented the basic setup of Zimbardo's experiment, the basement, the coin flip, the uniforms, to a completely different group of students.
Just told them about the setup.
They simply described the setup and asked the students to predict the outcome and the purpose of the study.
And what did they say?
An overwhelming 89.9% of the students accurately predicted that the experimenters wanted the guards to act in an oppressive, hostile manner and the prisoners to react passively.
Almost 90%. Because it's incredibly obvious. If a famous professor puts you in a fake prison in a basement, hands you a wooden baton, gives you mirrored sunglasses, and tells you to maintain order, you know exactly what play you have just been cast in.
You know the role.
You are performing the culturally ingrained archetype of the tough prison guard. You are putting on the mask that Hollywood and history have already designed for you.
You are co-creating the reality the authority figure desires. So the Stanford prison experiment doesn't prove that wearing a uniform turns you evil. It primarily proves that human beings are incredibly adept people pleasers who will go to great lengths to conform to the expectations of an authority figure.
But this raises a massive philosophical question for me. If the methodology was this flawed, if the guards were coached and the prisoners were faking it, why does this study still grip our collective consciousness?
It's a very appealing story.
Why is it still taught in schools? Why do we want to believe the myth of the Stanford prison experiment so badly?
We want to believe it because it offers us a profound, incredibly comforting moral excuse.
An excuse.
Yes. Think about the implications of Zimbardo's original conclusion. If merely putting on a uniform and stepping into a bad environment turns you into a sadist, then human evil isn't a personal moral failing, it's an environmental hazard, like tripping on a cracked sidewalk.
Oh, I see. It lets us off the hook.
Completely. It allows us to blame the situation or the uniform or the mask. It completely absolves the authentic self of any personal responsibility for cruelty.
It shifts the blame to the props.
It is the ultimate scientific extension of the "I was just following orders" defense, transformed into "the room made me do it, the sunglasses made me do it."
It's a morality play, disguised as science. It tells us that our shadow, our dark side, our cruelty is not our fault. We saw in Milgram that the tension between our internal morals and external authority can literally give us physical seizures.
We resist it, but ultimately break.
We saw in the Hamilton and Sanders workplace studies that we readily use conformity to excuse our bad actions at work. And in the SPE, we see how eagerly society will embrace a flawed scientific narrative simply because it tells us that our masks are entirely to blame for our sins.
We are constantly searching for ways to disconnect our core identity from the harm we cause while wearing our social roles. But this brings us to the final and perhaps most physically tragic layer of our deep dive.
We've established that the persona is a necessary tool for survival, but one that can fracture our identity. We've seen how organizations weaponize it, how authority demands blind obedience from it, and how we willingly use it as a scapegoat.
The structure of our social compliance.
But the lingering question remains, why are we so desperate to play these roles? Why do we put on the uniform? Why do we stay in the chair and press the 450-volt button? Why do we sacrifice our authentic selves so readily to the demands of the group?
Because the alternative is isolation. And the answer to why we fear isolation isn't just a matter of psychological preference, it is biological. It is a matter of literal physical survival.
It's wired into us.
We turn now to the physiological data, specifically the 2023 advisory from the Surgeon General of the United States, compiled by the National Center for Biotechnology Information, on our epidemic of loneliness and isolation.
Right, because we love to think of ourselves as these high-minded, rational, independent thinkers. But at the end of the day, underneath the LinkedIn profiles and the corporate jobs, we are human animals.
We are profoundly social mammals, and the human animal is biologically, evolutionarily wired for connection. Throughout the vast majority of our evolutionary history, our ability to rely on the group was the single primary requisite for survival.
You couldn't survive alone on the savannah.
If you were separated from your tribe on the savannah, you didn't just feel sad. You faced the elements, you faced predators, and you faced starvation. You died.
So our brains evolved to treat isolation as a mortal threat.
Exactly. The brain adapted to view a lack of social connection not just as a negative emotion, but as a severe, immediate physical emergency.
Now, the NCBI report makes a really crucial distinction here that I think we need to clarify. It differentiates between objective social isolation and subjective loneliness.
Yes. Objective social isolation is quantifiable. It means having few relationships, living alone, and having infrequent social interaction. Loneliness, however, is a subjective internal state.
It's how you feel about your connections.
Loneliness is defined as the distressing psychological experience that results from a discrepancy between an individual's preferred level of connection and their actual experience of connection.
So you could live in a cabin in the woods, not see anyone for a month, and be perfectly content. You were isolated, but not lonely. Conversely, you can live in an apartment in Manhattan, be surrounded by millions of people on your commute, have thousands of followers on your Instagram persona, and be profoundly, agonizingly lonely.
Because the connection isn't real.
Because your true self isn't actually connecting with anyone, you're just managing masks.
Precisely. And when that discrepancy exists, when the brain registers that your true self is fundamentally disconnected from the pack, it initiates a physiological cascade of panic. The research on the social brain highlights a specific neural network called the default mode network, or DMN.
The DMN. How does that work?
Think of the DMN like the background operating system of your smartphone. When you aren't actively using an app to complete a specific task, the OS is running in the background, organizing files, downloading updates, running the screensaver.
It's the baseline hum of the brain.
In the human brain, when you aren't focused on a specific task, the DMN activates. It's involved in daydreaming, recalling memories, and heavily involved in social cognition, thinking about yourself in relation to others.
Okay, so it's the brain's baseline state.
Right. But when a human is chronically lonely, when they lack authentic connection, it's like that background operating system gets hijacked by malware. The DMN goes into a state of hypervigilance.
Looking for threats.
It begins constantly, obsessively scanning the environment for social threats. It assumes you are cast out of the tribe, and therefore everything is a potential predator.
Your brain essentially hits the evolutionary alarm bell and just leaves it ringing 24/7.
Which leads to a devastating physiological response. This chronic state of perceived threat activates the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, the HPA axis. This is the body's primary stress response system.
And what does that do?
When activated, it floods your bloodstream with cortisol, the primary stress hormone.
Now, cortisol isn't inherently bad, right? If I'm hiking and I see a bear, I want a massive spike of cortisol so I can run away or fight.
In short, acute bursts, cortisol saves your life. It increases your heart rate, halts non-essential functions like digestion, and pushes energy to your muscles. But cortisol is meant to be flushed from the system once the threat is gone.
But if you're chronically lonely, it isn't flushed.
When it is sustained over long periods, days, months, years due to chronic loneliness, it stops being a lifesaver and acts as a slow, corrosive poison to the body and the brain.
What does that constant cortisol drip actually do to the brain?
The neurological consequences are measurable and severe. Sustained cortisol release leads to hippocampal atrophy. The hippocampus is the brain region vital for memory consolidation and emotional regulation. Under chronic stress, it physically shrinks.
It physically shrinks your brain.
Simultaneously, it amplifies the reactivity of the amygdala, the brain's fear center. This creates an extreme hair-trigger emotional sensitivity to perceived threats or rejections.
So because you are lonely, your brain physically changes to become more fearful, more anxious, and less capable of regulating your emotions, which probably makes it even harder to connect with people. It's a vicious cycle.
It is entirely corrosive. The NCBI data shows that chronic isolation is a potent physiological stressor that drastically increases the risk of major depressive disorder, generalized anxiety, neurodegenerative diseases like Alzheimer's, cardiovascular disease, and premature mortality.
It's essentially an illness.
The epidemiological effect sizes of chronic loneliness are comparable to smoking 15 cigarettes a day. It is literally killing us.
And we can't ignore the physical reality of the body here. The report touches on touch deprivation. Because we do so much of our interaction through our digital personas now, through screens, we are losing physical contact.
A critical loss for a social mammal.
The data points out that tactile sensations, a hug, a handshake, a hand on the shoulder, are fundamental regulatory mechanisms for our nervous system. Physical touch lowers heart rate and blood pressure.
It provides immediate physiological reassurance.
When you are isolated behind a mask, the absence of touch becomes an agonizing chronic stressor in its own right. Your physical body is literally screaming for tactile validation, that you exist, that you belong to someone, that you are part of a group.
If we connect this biological reality to the bigger psychological picture we have been discussing, this is where the philosophy of the mask and the biology of the human animal converge in a truly, profoundly dangerous way.
Okay, lay it out for me.
The fundamental human need for belonging, for authentic connection, is so powerful and so deeply tied to our core biological survival mechanisms that a starving, lonely person will seek out connection even in incredibly harmful, destructive ways.
Wait, I want to make sure I understand the implication here. If isolation is literally causing brain damage, if it is flooding my system with toxic levels of cortisol and acting like a pack of cigarettes a day, shouldn't I just join any group that will take me?
Any group at all.
I mean, from a purely biological standpoint, isn't any connection, even a toxic one, better than the physical pain of loneliness?
That is exactly the trap. That is the dark heart of the human condition. And that is why the psychology of conformity is so dangerous. To escape the physical, agonizing trauma of isolation, people will enthusiastically adopt a destructive Jungian persona. They will eagerly conform to horrific group norms.
Because the group offers an end to the loneliness.
Yes. This biological desperation explains why isolated individuals are so susceptible to joining extremist political groups, violent street gangs, cults, or profoundly toxic, abusive corporate cultures.
They just want to belong.
The biological need for the safety of the pack overrides the moral compass of the authentic self.
Because in an extremist group, or a rigid hierarchy, the rules of belonging are incredibly clear. The uniform is provided. The mask is handed to you.
There's no ambiguity.
You don't have to navigate the terrifying, ambiguous vulnerability of showing people your authentic, messy self and risking rejection. You just put on the mask, you obey the leader, and you are instantly accepted. You are safe.
As the Surgeon General's report notes, highly cohesive groups exude massive pressures to conform. And they do this often with the explicit or implicit threat of ostracization if you don't comply.
If you don't conform, you're out.
If you step out of line, you are cast out. And because your nervous system is absolutely terrified of returning to the isolated, cortisol-drenched state that was literally destroying your brain, you will do whatever the group asks to maintain your membership.
You will sit in the chair at Yale and administer the 450-volt shock because the experimenter represents the authority of the group.
Exactly.
You will follow your boss's orders and dump the toxic waste into the river because defying him means losing your job and your social standing.
It's all driven by the fear of exclusion.
You will put on the khaki uniform and the mirrored sunglasses in the Stanford basement and degrade your fellow students because the warden tells you that's what a good guard does to help the team.
You do these things not simply because you harbor a secret sadistic evil. You do them because you are a biological creature terrified of being alone. You sacrifice the authentic self to the persona because the persona guarantees your inclusion in the group. You trade your morality for the illusion of safety.
It is a tragically perfect dark loop. Society demands that we wear a mask to function. We put on the mask because we are biologically desperate to belong. The mask is then weaponized by authority figures who demand our obedience.
It's a systemic exploitation of our biology.
We commit crimes of conformity, hurting others to maintain our status in the pack. We then blame the mask, the uniform, the situation, the orders to protect our own conscience. And we refuse to ever take the mask off because beneath it lies the terrifying vulnerability of being truly known and the biological terror of being rejected.
It is a formidable trap. But recognizing the architecture of this trap is the first necessary step toward dismantling it. This brings us back to Jung's concept of individuation.
Finding the balance.
The goal is the realization that the mask is not you. It is a tool. Building a flexible persona, one that honors the true self while maintaining a healthy, boundaried connection to the community is the only way to break the cycle of destructive obedience and isolating fragmentation. You must learn to tolerate the discomfort of authenticity.
Okay. Let's take a breath and look at the incredible, unsettling journey we just took today. We started with Carl Jung, unmasking the persona. We saw how it's a necessary compromise we make with society, but how that mask can fracture.
Especially in the digital age, bleeding our repressed shadow into the anonymity of the internet until the whole structure collapses.
We then moved into the sociology of the workplace, seeing how Hamilton and Sanders proved that we use conformity and obedience as psychological shields, readily surrendering our agency to authority figures to excuse our participation in harmful systems.
He sat in the agonizing tension of the room with Stanley Milgram, watching ordinary people tear themselves apart physically, enduring seizures rather than simply disobey a man in a lab coat.
We tore down the comforting textbook lie of the Stanford prison experiment. We realized that we prefer to blame our environments and our uniforms for our cruelty, rather than face our own eager compliance.
And finally, we hit the biological bedrock. The terrifying medical reality that our brains are so evolutionarily desperate for connection that we will fuse our identities with the darkest masks imaginable just to avoid the physical, neurological trauma of being alone.
It is a profound, demanding realization. It asks us to do something incredibly difficult to bear the heavy weight of our own autonomy.
To take ownership of the self.
It asks us to refuse the easy excuses of the group, to question the orders of the hierarchy, and to tolerate the deep discomfort of being authentic in a world that constantly, systematically rewards conformity.
It is the work of a lifetime to ensure that when you look in the mirror, the face looking back is your own.
So as we close this deep dive, I want to leave you, the listener, with a thought. Something to chew on when you are commuting tomorrow morning or when you're scrolling endlessly through your feeds tonight.
It's worth reflecting on.
Think about the various roles you played today. Think about the employee who nodded along in the Zoom meeting. Think about the friend who laughed at a joke they didn't find funny. Think about the digital avatar that posted a perfectly curated photo.
The daily masks.
Think about the things you said today because the role demanded it, not because your core self actually believed it. If you were suddenly stripped of all your titles, if you were forced to delete all your profiles, burn your resume, and hand back your uniform,
If the stage was empty.
if you were placed entirely alone in an empty room, would you recognize the person left sitting in the chair? Or have you been wearing the mask for so long that you've forgotten the face beneath it?